Tensions are as strained as they've ever been between the United States and its allies, particularly here with the Europeans, who are a big part of the NATO alliance. President Trump has frequently hurled insults at European leaders, but they remain reluctant to join the war against Iran. Spain has denied the use of its airspace to aid the war in Iran. France and Italy have reportedly done the same. The British Prime Minister has said this is not the United Kingdom's war, and the German Chancellor does not want the country to get involved. President Trump has now criticized his NATO allies in a Truth Social post, suggesting that from now on, they are on their own.
All of those countries that can't get jet fuel because of the Strait of Hormuz, like the United Kingdom, which refused to get involved in the decapitation of Iran, you'll have to start learning how to fight for yourself. The USA won't be there to help you anymore, just like you weren't there for us. Iran has been essentially decimated. The hard part is done. Go get your own oil.
To discuss this further, we have Dr. Leslie Vinjamuri with us. She is the president and CEO of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and an expert on international relations and diplomacy. Hi, Dr. Vinjamuri. Thanks for joining us. Strong words from President Trump there.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. Strong words from President Donald Trump there. Do you believe they mark a breaking point in U.S. relations with NATO allies in Europe?
The president is clearly trying to send a signal. And the relationship between the United States and its European allies has been fraught and challenged really since before President Trump was elected. But there's no doubt that this is a turning point, that the president's decision to work alongside Israel to launch those strikes some 32 days ago, not to involve Europe in the conversation, not to work with Europe, not to align Europe, and then to turn and not only demand that Europe support the United States, but to use NATO, the threat to withdraw America's support from NATO, from America's European allies, is really an extraordinary violation of really the sanctity of that commitment for more than almost 8 decades. And so I think this is extraordinary. The thing with President Trump is that we don't know whether he will follow through on that, whether he will change his mind. But right now, he's clearly trying to put inordinate pressure on Europe and is clearly very upset that many European countries are not stepping up and aligning with U.S. policy or responding to U.S. requests to use air bases and support in any other number of ways.
Remind us, is this rift primarily over the Iran war or one that's been growing over the last few years?
I think the rift has been growing. I think President Trump's disruption, his use of tariffs to coerce America's allies on questions of trade and economic exchange, but also to use tariffs to coerce on questions, think back to the early days of this year when President Trump was threatening to annex or to take over Greenland, threatened to punish those Europeans who wouldn't come along with that U.S. desire. Tariffs were going to be leveraged on that. So I think, the tariff threat's been profound. The fact that the U.S. president has been aligning himself in this early months with Vladimir Putin, much more so than with President Zelensky and with NATO allies on the question of defending Ukraine. I mean, those two issues really disrupted and have unsettled the transatlantic partnership. And now Iran comes, and that is really it's sort of another level. I think it's in some ways even more destructive because it's a war that Europe sees to be, and indeed is, an illegal war by any measure of international law. A war that doesn't have a clear objective or a clear goal, and that hasn't really been in any way seriously sold to the European people, to the American people, to European allies. So for all those reasons, the illegality, the sense of not really having a process or a foreign policy objective, and the damage and the disruption that is truly extraordinary with no clear end in sight I think this has taken that level of rupture to a new level. And remember that European publics are not bought into this war, and that puts a lot of pressure on European leaders who have to, on the one hand, manage the relationship with the United States, and on the other hand, manage domestic electoral politics, democratic pushback, public opinion that is becoming increasingly anti-American. This is a very difficult position for European leaders to be in.
We'll get to some of those points in just a minute, but apart from the tariffs that you mentioned, there have also been near daily insults against European countries and leaders. What do you suppose the US president hopes to achieve with this? It looks like it is his strategy, but is he actually just pushing them further away?
I think President Trump has a few different aims. I think we have to remember that he is always speaking to the base, his MAGA base in the Republican Party, demonstrating a certain kind of bravado, willingness to be norm busting, not to play by convention, to play tough with Europe, to really be seen to be an American president that puts America first and won't suffer any in the language of that movement, any fools. So there is a domestic audience, but on the European side of the ledger, I do think that he believes that by playing tough, by threatening to withhold U.S. Commitments, but by adopting this certain language and style that you refer to, I think he firmly believes that he's going to have more impact. I think he firmly believes that President Biden, President Obama, practically virtually every single president other than him has made the mistake of giving too much away for too little, and that they've played by a set of rules and norms that has not serviced America. So I think he's committed to it. I think he believes in it. I think he thinks it works. And I don't think he's really, on this dimension, I don't think he's really getting the feedback, or if he is, he's not really channeling it into his style.
There are big questions around the legality of US and Israeli actions in Iran, as you've already mentioned. The German parliament, for instance, has called the war a violation of international law. The UK government has called it illegal. Can you walk us through why the Europeans are refusing to join their major NATO ally in the Iran war?
Well, as you've just very wisely outlined, there's a clear view based on deep expertise and deep commitments that the war is illegal, that there is no basis in international law. There's no basis in the U.S. Congress, which has the authority to, make the decision about going to war. So they can't read a morality or a legality that's based within the United States. They can't read legality or a legal basis in international law. They don't see domestic popular support. And Europe, for a very long time, has rightfully prided itself on taking international law very, very seriously. And when international law doesn't allow Europeans to engage in the kind of international uses of force that they think are important, they've gotten behind efforts to change that law. So if you think back to the responsibility to protect, European leaders took that very seriously as a new normative standard for when to think about using force in ways that were designed to recognize that sometimes certain state leaders commit atrocities that mean that the use of force might be legitimate, even when it's not about violating sovereignty. So I think this European commitment to law is profound, it's serious. And so this is why I think they're really holding the line on President Trump. In part, it's also because of these earlier things that we've discussed, that the profound lack of commitment to the European, to America's European allies, to NATO, the unwillingness of the president to really just declare that, to state it, to make the case for the importance of the transatlantic relationship. And this preceded the election of Donald Trump. I think we saw it, many of us who were watching this anticipated rightly that Europe would be on the receiving end of the toughest end of Donald Trump's disruption to norms, to law, to partnerships, to long-standing alliances, and that has definitely proven to be the case.
I wonder, what options do Europeans have? Can they afford a long-time rupture in the relationship with the US?
I don't think so, but there is a bit of a game here, right? So on the first, European states individually have done a very good job at investing more, making greater commitments to spending on domestic national security and defense, and investing in their own capabilities. They've done less well at coordinating and aligning their procurement strategies and the different parts of their investments so that they can really scale and take advantage of the Europeanness of those investments collectively. So that's an area for working together. But if they could overcome, the fact that there are multiple different states and align their investments, that would certainly allow Europe a whole lot more of that strategic autonomy that is the goal right now. I think also Europeans have done an admirable job in a short amount of time of diversifying some of their trading partnerships. The EU-India deal really moved ahead and was driven. There was new momentum on the back of Donald Trump's claims on Greenland, which really motivated Europeans to sort of speed things up elsewhere. So some of those efforts have been serious and significant and important, certainly on the trading side, but ultimately Europe remains dependent on the United States for technology, for advances on artificial intelligence. That's much harder to sort of decouple from the United States. And even the investments in defense and security and those capabilities, that is a long-term play. It takes time to get to the point where Europe could even imagine being fully independent. And time is not on Europe's side. With Russia's aggression in Ukraine, with the threat that China presents on certain dimensions, with the war in the Middle East. And I guess the other factor that is well worth watching is, and people are reluctant to concede the point that America could change again and become more friendly, more diplomatic, more democratic, more stable, less disruptive. Nobody wants to concede that because people are so deeply disenchanted and disenfranchised by the US. But it is entirely possible that this is a very difficult moment, and that the next stage, while there's no going back completely, that the next stage will be one of rebuilding and restoring and reinvesting a transformed and different but positive transatlantic partnership. Nobody wants to hear that. Very few people believe it, but I do think it's actually a definite possibility.
Mm-hmm. This war must come with significant costs for the Trump administration, and I mean quite literally financially. What, in your assessment, do they hope to achieve with this war?
It is an extraordinarily expensive war, just in terms of the amount of money that's being spent every day. It is an expensive war. We are days and weeks away from having a really significant domestic impact on, we're already experiencing price of gas, but those prices are going to infiltrate and affect all manner of things much more in the days and weeks ahead. The instability is going to potentially bring the US in, and this is what we're waiting to see. Will Donald Trump look at this war that's really gotten out of his control, that has escalated in ways that he perhaps should have imagined, but clearly did not? Will that lead him to negotiate a deal, or simply to say he's done? Or those troops, those 10,000 troops that have been sent to the region, will he use those for some sort of ground war? And this should be, to your question, this should be something that President Trump is thinking about with a clear-minded and analytical approach to the benefits and especially the costs economically, politically, in strategic terms to America's allies. And so far, we are not really seeing that clear-headed analysis influence policy. We're not even hearing what that clear-headed analysis is. But we are told that, and I do believe that all of these possibilities are very much on the table, that Donald Trump might cut and run, or that he might double down and send in U.S. troops, which would be an extraordinary step for this U.S. president to take.
Thank you for your deep analysis and insights, Dr. Leslie Vinjamuri of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs.
Thank you so much for having me.
On Tuesday, Spain's government doubled down on its opposition to the war in Iran. Here's what the Spanish defense minister said about the country's decision to close its airspace and military bases for U.S. operations against Iran.
Rechazamos plenamente.
We fully reject the unilateral, unjustified aggression that has no legal framework whatsoever by the United States and Israel against Iran. Just as we strongly condemn the aggressive attacks by Iran on neighbouring countries. We must all operate respecting the international legal order. Without that, it's impossible to achieve global stability or establish stable frameworks for peace. In this specific case, with regard to the Iranian regime, it must be said that the United States and Israel cannot be the ones to decide what kind of peace or what kind of rules there should be in the world, without taking anyone into account, not their allies and not even part of the US population.
British Prime Minister Keir Starmer has also made it clear British troops would not join any ground invasion of Iran. Here is what he said.
This is not our war and we're not going to get drawn into it. What we have done is taken defensive action. So we've had our pilots up in the air since an hour or two after this war started, defending British lives, British interests, and of course our allies in the region. We're allowing our bases to be used for defensive action to protect British lives and British interests and our allies in the region. And we are looking to see what we can do in the Straits of Hormuz, but we're not going to get dragged into this war.
We've talked about the politics surrounding President Trump's dealing with America's allies when it comes to the war with Iran. But how does all this play out militarily? Glenn Ignazio is a retired major and U.S. Air Force Special Operations Commander. He's an expert on U.S. military affairs and national security, and he joins me now from San Diego, California. Glenn, thank you so much for being here.
Happy to be with you. Thank you for the invite.
Now, relations between NATO and the U.S. have been tense since Donald Trump returned to the White House. He has described NATO members as cowards and called the alliance a paper tiger. How much further have relations been strained since the start of the war in Iran?
I think there are definitely some major hits before we even started in Iran. First of all, I'm apolitical. I give you the facts and let your basically your watchers decide what they want. The thing that I think bothered us first, both as veterans and I think globally, is one of the comments that was even before that, NATO didn't really help us out before. And honestly, tremendous amount of friends and soldiers in Afghanistan, Iraq, and everything where NATO did step up. So, that was one thing that was definitely off, and that sort of started it. The same thing of calling them cowards and so forth. When 9/11 hit and attacked us, NATO was one of the ones that stepped up the most in particular this operation. So, that is very concerning as far as, projecting that type of attitude. Now, when it comes to Iran, Iran is an interesting beast here because as we look at NATO and you look at these articles like Article 4 or Article 5, these articles define of how does NATO come together when somebody is threatened or somebody is attacked. And in these situations, this conflict, it may be NATO countries that can assist us, but the NATO organization itself, these articles which are talking about if one of these nations is attacked, anybody, that collaborative effort is a different beast than what's going on in Iran. So I think that individual countries and offering to individual countries or asking them to be involved is definitely plausible. It's quite a right. NATO as an organization, I think that's a little bit different as far as how it's structured. But at the same time, I would hope that the NATO countries and our allies wouldn't be much of a blocking as much as if they decide to get in. I'd like to see them more on a defensive nature. I think that's what people would anticipate being directly and part of the attacks or anything in Iran.
What could this mean on a military level? Could we, for example, see the US refusing to come to the assistance of a European NATO member in the event of a potential attack by Russia?
Yeah, I think that there may be heavy words, coming out of President Trump. And at the same time, when you ask the generals and the military and everything that goes historically, because, we do change presidents every 4 years or 8 years, depending on it, is that if a NATO country is particularly attacked, that we would come to their particular aid. Now, underneath, again, NATO is the alliance of when one's attacked, we all come to the defense of that. That's one of the biggest things that was the premise against, say, the Soviet Union and now Russia and others. So the countries that do get involved, it's up to them as far as that they're providing military aid or they would be involved in an attack to defend a country of NATO. So the interesting part is how this comes in. I do believe that we would come to the aid of any country in NATO, in reality, outside of the politics of what we hear verbally. Again, that's very strong because if we didn't, or any nation in NATO did not back up some others, that really defines, or I wouldn't say define, it completely dissolves what NATO and that organized alliance against, say, Russia just falls apart. So words may be one thing, but actions definitely have to be different. And that's one of the things that we should absolutely back any country that is attacked.
Well, so far, European nations seem united in their determination to keep out of the war. Spain, France and Italy have all refused to provide the US with military assistance. Could that change if the consequences of the war, such as fuel shortages and rising inflation, become more serious?
Yeah, and you're seeing some of that globally. I mean, even the Philippines declared an energy crisis, an energy emergency because of the impact of the war. And again, this comes back to things where, the United States doesn't use as much oil or use any oil really that comes out of the Arabian or Persian Gulf. But at the same time, the rest of the world does. So it is impacting everything. So one of the statements was, why aren't you getting involved when this is your oil, your energy, and so forth? But at the same time, this attack came from the United States. And, people go back and forth as if this is right or if it's wrong. And there are a lot of premises about going into Iran and then a lot of other things not. So back to the point, though, one of the things I think that also is a concern is, where NATO sits, or at least the NATO countries sit. We saw an attack, or at least a launch from Iran to Diego Garcia. It's approximately 4,000 kilometers. In fact, Iran always claimed, and this is the part about being a little elusive and deceptive, that they could only do 2,000. Now, when you talk about that distance, Diego Garcia, you're talking about a launch from Iran that could get all the way practically to the UK. So that means any of the countries in Europe could actually receive a missile launch from Iran. Again, that's speculative, but at the same time, that's a lot more direct as far as an attack than versus the United States. So there's a different danger there. So maybe that's it. There's a lot of politics, again, as we talk about where some of the NATO countries or some countries in general may not get directly involved. I think that one of the things that I find interesting historically is when France and Spain shutting their airspace, that is directly opposing the operations versus not getting involved. The reason why I bring this up is years ago when we basically went in after Gaddafi, after the bombing in Lockerbie of the 747. When we went in there, France actually shut down the airspace, and our bombers had to fly from England a long duration around France to hit Libya. That duration, fatigue, air refueling, actually, we lost air crews because of that. So that was one of the things. Now to see both Spain and France jump on that bandwagon, I think that's really pushing it a little bit. One of the reasons why Italy can't do this, and they mentioned this about Sigonella in Sicily, is because their constitution is very strict about what operations they can support with Italy, or with the United States. So until their constitution, or at least their Congress, would meet to alleviate that, that's the reason why Italy can't help us. So it's a little bit different than saying you will versus not being able to. And France and Spain, I think that's pretty devastating for them to do that. And I'm trying to figure out politically how they're playing it.
Well, Donald Trump has also been very vocal in threatening to take over Greenland, which is part of the NATO member Denmark. Is there a scenario in which European NATO members could become more accommodating to the US in return for Trump dropping that threat?
think it's one of these things, and I mean, we look at it. We have a big base in Greenland. You know, we've operated in there for a long time, especially there and in Iceland. And I think that one of the things, and I do understand, again, from a military perspective, against China and against Russia, about where that is. The Arctic and the poles are becoming very critical as far as where these particular adversaries against us, for us, whatever, are concerned. So let's just focus on China and Russia. Very critical. So Greenland is one of those spots that's very pivotal. Now, we know that there's not that many people there. There's not that much of a military presence other than the U.S. And honestly, if one of the countries wanted to make a move, it'd be very difficult to defend. So the statement of being there proactively, okay, I agree with that. But as far as taking it into a U.S. territory, that's an interesting beast, because we can completely say, I would say, increase the military presence and do other things to protect Greenland, to defend it and keep it from being, say, taken over from China or Russia proactively. But as far as taking it into an American territory, I think that's very, very confusing. It's against Denmark. And I think that the leader of NATO, the secretary of NATO, says, hey, working with the United States to defend Greenland is definitely more plausible than us taking it over. So again, I think that there's some real lines that are being crossed there that we can, again, defend it, but not occupy it or take it. And I don't think we would do a hardcore military action, like I think a lot of people speculated and so forth.
Glenn, you've been involved at a senior level in the U.S. military, and you've already shared so many of these valuable anecdotes. How do you see this Iran war playing out?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for those compliments. And, you know, spending a lot of time around the world gets you a realistic perspective. And so when we look at Iran, you know, first of all, is Iran has never been so weak, and people have to understand how brutal that regime is. And I'm not talking about, you know, reading things, watching things. You have to really understand the people of Iran, what they've experienced, or people that have lived there and maybe living, you know, in the United States or other countries in Europe. It is absolutely amazing how destructive that regime has been, or I should say oppressive. So with the economic impacts, the people that were protesting, and again, a lot of them got slaughtered, it was the weakest time that this regime has ever had since the 70s. And if you look at the 70s, the country was rather free. It was almost like miniskirts, happy people, everything. It was just a whole different world. So this regime has threatened both the entire European, Middle Eastern countries, you know, the Houthis, Hezbollah, Hamas, all that. So this was one of those interesting things, and the only time that something could occur. Again, people agree with it, don't agree with it. However, now that we're in these operations in Iran, there's three ways that this really could go that we're focusing on. Okay, so say it's utopia. The regime changes to become more of a free country. The protesters are able to be free, and we become more, or we get to see more of a free Iran. So that completely dissolves all the terrorist organizations. The countries sit more at ease, and we don't have these threats and terrorist threats as much as we have. Heck, I would love to visit Iran one of these days. Now, that would be utopia. The second one is where we get into it, where we have the IRGC, or maybe some of these moderates that are supposedly being discussed right now, that there's some kind of engagement with them to sort of alleviate the war. But also, IRGC would be still pretty hard as far as managing the country. If the IRGC as an iron fist takes over, you can expect things to be bad for the protesters, and we get into a very hardened regime. And that's one of the things where they would probably pursue even further a nuclear weapon. A lighter part, more to the moderate side, I think that you would get people that may be able to work with the United States more collaboratively, and in such a way where the uranium is given over. The Straits of Hormuz are now equally managed and operated, where it's not one country, Iran, running it. Those are sort of the three options. We used to entertain that maybe there'd be a complete power play if there was no government and the secular violence that would occur like to Iraq. I think we're further away from that, and I think we're more into those first three that I mentioned.
Three options, each one remarkably different from the other. Regardless of which one plays out, do you see the war ending anytime soon?
You know, that's always the million-dollar question. You know, it's each event that really plays as far as what's going to determine this. I mean, I think the biggest focus right now that everybody's focused on is the Straits of Hormuz, right? It impacts everybody globally. We see all the prices. We see everybody very upset about it. There's at least 2,000 ships sitting on both the other sides of the straits trying to get in and out, and there's only like 20 getting through. So that is really problematic. The other thing I think that was also problematic is that seeing these allied countries countries, and I would say friendly countries, but also friendly to Iran, being attacked. UAE, Saudi Arabia, all these countries was absolutely devastating and surprising. I mean, when you look at, say, the UAE, Ras Al Khaimah, which is the emirate that's closest to the Straits of Hormuz, they never had a big military presence to protect the Straits because I don't think they ever expected Iran to attack. So if you think about it, the leader of Abu Dhabi, Sharjah, and Dubai are actually married into Iranian families where their wives are. So this has been the hard part about defending that and also being able to take out these particular targets. I don't know if we're going to last another month or 2 months, but if we do put boots on the ground, we are looking for a further time because it's not just getting them in. It's the time of getting them out with an exit criteria and specific objectives that must be met. It cannot be vague. It cannot be broad. It has to be clear.
So how can the security of states in the Gulf region be assured once the current conflict is resolved?
Well, I think that if the conflict is resolved, now there's, again, two parts to this as far as what we were talking about before. So the utopia, things are at peace and we're sort of in that rebuilding. I think UAE has been hit more than others. But at the same time, if we pull out and there's still some of the hardened sides to this or the hardened part of the regimes, you start looking at it that Iran really could be part of, or it could be completely controlling the Straits of Hormuz. And that would be dangerous for everybody, as they're talking about charging, ships and so forth. I think there still becomes a threat as far as what they existed before. However, their military offensive with their Air Force and Navy being destroyed has been reduced. The worst part about this, and this is where Khamenei, who was the first one that was killed and now his son has taken over, this really hardens Iran, again, if it's the IRGC, to get a nuclear weapon. And the reason for it is this, is that if you look at, say, Libya or you look at Ukraine, they gave up their nuclear weapons. And when they did that, look what happened. Libya is now destroyed. They had a civil war. Ukraine is getting decimated by Russia. You look at North Korea that has nukes and nobody's messing with them. So I think they would get to that if that hardcore regime stays in place, and that's dangerous. However, I do believe that the U.S. is looking for an off-road so it doesn't become a forever war. I don't think we'll get into that. I think we've learned a lesson rather well in Iraq and Afghanistan. I think that's what the people are most worried about, and they bring it up more and more than ever. But what are the specific objectives that need to be met? We waffle on hearing that from President Trump, but those are the things that need to be met. And again, an exit criteria, an exit strategy. If we just pulled out right now, I think the IRGC and others would be taking over. And that's what even Saudi Arabia and the UAE are pushing President Trump to get into the ground, to push a regime change. That's impressive to see, or at least very interesting to see from those countries pushing that.
Thank you so much for your experience and all of your insights. That's Glenn Ignazio, a retired major and U.S. Air Force Special Operations Commander and an expert on U.S. military affairs and national security. What do you think? Does the Iran war mark a breaking point in U.S. relations with NATO allies here in Europe? Let us know in the comments below. Bye for now.